Pulavinaka, welcome everyone to the first in a series of our Blue Pacific Talanoa. And to start it off, we now will join Dame Meg Taylor, the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum.
Thank you very much, Penny. Good morning and a very warm welcome to you all. This is really very exciting. This is our first of the Pacific Talanoa series, and which is an online platform set up so that we can share our points of view and learn from each other as we discuss issues that are very important to us in the region. But before I proceed, I need to thank the panelists who have joined us this morning. Ambassador Kainaki Lua Pareti, Ms. Kathy Jetnil-Kijiner, and Mr. Ernest Gibson for giving us the opportunity to hear and discuss their perspectives on an issue of importance to all of us here in the Pacific, ranging from the global, regional and national levels to our very own young climate change leaders. As we know, the science is clear and confirms that we are indeed facing a climate change crisis with our future. The peoples living on Sea of Islands are very much uncertain unless the world acts decisively and with absolute urgency. The Kainaki Lua Declaration for Urgent Climate Change Action now not only reaffirms our region's commitment to the Paris Agreement, but committed to a single regional position on climate change, the strongest statement that the Pacific Islands Forum has ever issued as a collective on climate change. A feat that is remarkable, given the diversity of the Forum membership and the positions countries have taken on this issue. The strength of the consensus formed around Kainaki Lua speaks to the strength of our collective and to our solidarity as a Blue Pacific family. This solidarity was very reassuring to see with the region coming together in April this year and establishing the Pacific humanitarian pathway on COVID-19 under the Kainaki Declaration. And this was to collectively respond to the health pandemic to ensure that we could get supplies to the most vulnerable of our member states. So our strength as a region is in our collective voice and action. And we really need to continue to highlight and promote this if we are able to overcome this climate change crisis, which has been compounded further by these new emerging threats, such as COVID-19. But above all, it's really about us, we, the people of the Pacific, about our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. The Kainaki Lua is our voice, our call for urgent action now. And today we learn where we are 1 year on. And I really sincerely hope that this discussion will prompt a collective stocktake on where we stand in our commitments to the calls of the Kainaki Lua Declaration. It's also a reaffirmation of our call on the international community to join the Pacific in taking urgent action to deal with the climate change crisis despite the COVID-19 epidemic. And for us in the Pacific, we have to join together to keep that pressure on the international community. Let me welcome the United Kingdom's representative who will be speaking with us today, and also the United Kingdom's outreach as the COP26 president, and through their leadership with the support of this region, mobilize global commitments to our calls for urgent action now. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the robust discussion this morning, and I'm really delighted that so many people in the region have joined us today for this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary General. Now we'll move on to the next segment of our Talanoa, which is to introduce all our panels. There are 4 of them, and Dame Meg Taylor had mentioned Excellency Ken O'Flaherty, who is the United Kingdom's COP26 Regional Ambassador for Asia Pacific and South Asia. Also, we're having Mr. Exsley Taloiburi, who is no stranger to those of us in the Pacific Islands on climate change. He's the team leader for the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, Climate Change and Resilience. We also have Ms. Kathy Jetnil-Kijiner, who is the Climate Envoy for the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And our fourth member of the panel is Mr. Ernest Gibson, who is the Fiji Youth Leader and member of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. Now, all members of the panel will have opening statements of approximately 3 minutes each, and before we'll then open up the discussion for your questions and also maybe some comments. So without further ado, we welcome particularly His Excellency Ken O'Flaherty, who's joining us as the United Kingdom's COP26 Regional Ambassador for Asia, Pacific, and South Asia. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be joining this session today, and I must thank the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat for this opportunity. For us, as part of our COP26 presidency, the Pacific is a key partner for us in ensuring the success of the event in November next year. We know that the Pacific has been seeing the consequences of climate change for decades now, despite not being responsible for the vast majority of the damaging emissions worldwide. As COP26 presidency, the UK is very grateful for the role which the Pacific is already playing in keeping the drumbeat of ambition on climate alive. As you know, the COP26 summit has been postponed until November next year due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but we are very clear that climate action cannot wait. So we welcome very strongly the vital messages from the Kainaki Lua Declaration. We want to drive forward global action on key issues which are raised in that declaration, such as mitigation, climate finance, adaptation and resilience, clean growth, and nature. Firstly, we need all countries to take the opportunities of the green recovery and turn them into ambitious NDCs, nationally determined contributions. We welcome the leadership that several Pacific states are already showing, such as the Marshall Islands, by submitting ambitious updated NDCs. And we are clear this will help drive global momentum for ambition. Secondly, we're clear that progress on climate finance is absolutely essential. We in the UK have doubled our national contribution on climate finance to £11.6 billion, and we're encouraging other donors to follow suit. We also want to help Pacific partners to access climate finance that is available. We, in partnership with Belize and Fiji, will virtually host the first half of the SIDS Access to Finance Identifying Solutions Conference later this month. Thirdly, we want to increase ambition on adaptation and resilience. We have to scale up action and support on loss and damage and enable the most climate vulnerable countries to adapt. Building on the call for action on adaptation and resilience launched at UNCAS last year will be a key part of this. Fourthly, we want to work with all countries, including in the Pacific, to share the opportunities of clean growth. Solar and wind are already cheaper than new coal power in 2/3 of the world and will undercut commissioned coal and gas almost everywhere by 2030. So we must now accelerate the transition to a clean energy future. Finally, climate change and biodiversity loss are inseparable, requiring global action to tackle the two challenges together. In particular, we must protect our oceans. I'm very pleased to note that countries such as Fiji, Palau, and Vanuatu have already joined the Global Ocean Alliance, which seeks to protect 30% of our world's oceans by 2030. As you may have heard, last week, our Prime Minister announced that the UK will host a virtual ambition summit on the 12th of December on the 5-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. This will provide a platform for leaders who are ready to come forward with announcements of new, more ambitious NDCs and long-term strategies to net zero, as well as new climate finance pledges and ambitious adaptation plans. We look forward to ambitious participation from our Pacific partners, and I'm determined to continue to work with our Pacific friends closely in the months ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency O'Flaherty. giving us that global perspective on the campaign on climate change. Now we'll join Mr. Exsley Taloiburi, who is the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat Team Leader on Climate Change and Resilience, to give us a regional perspective.
Thank you very much, Facilitator, and a very good morning to you all. As the Secretary General has highlighted earlier, Forum leaders remain committed to the implementation of the Paris Agreement, with the Kainaki Lua Declaration for Urgent Climate Change Action now reaffirming that commitment. I don't think any one of us ever imagined the world coming to a standstill as currently experienced with COVID-19. More alarmingly, it should not be used as an excuse to delay much needed urgent climate change action and should not trigger economic recovery that puts this world on a development pathway that takes us beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius to a point of no return. The science is very clear. We are now at 1.1 degrees Celsius, and if unabated, some of our low-lying atolls will become uninhabitable within our lifetime. Every year that international climate change action is delayed, our future as a region becomes more uncertain. The 10 calls underpinning the Kainaki Lua Declaration are for real, tangible outcomes that will ensure the survival of our Blue Pacific, our blue planet, and the basis for aligning COVID-19 recovery with the Paris Agreement objectives. So where are we as a region? First, our carbon footprint is negligible compared to the rest of the world. However, our Pacific countries are punching above their weight in terms of current NDC targets. 2020 requires all countries to submit revised NDCs and formulate low-emission development strategies. RMI is the first globally to submit its revised NDC, and along with Fiji, have already developed their mid-century low-emission development strategies. We also upload the new climate finance commitments that have been announced and call on all developed countries that are yet to do so to deliver on their commitment towards the collective contribution of 100 billion by 2020. Although 2 billion of climate finance has been approved to our region in the past decade, access procedures remain cumbersome with lengthy delays in disbursement. Measuring the effectiveness and impact of these resources where most needed continues to be an issue. To be sustainable, such resourcing need to be complemented with strengthening of national PFM systems and institutional capacities. These challenges prompted members to set up the Pacific Resilience Facility to facilitate timely access to small grants for communities across the Pacific to build their resilience against climate and disaster impacts. Finally, at COP25, our region was able to secure support for the UNFCCC to convene a dialogue on the Ocean Climate Nexus, which must take place prior to COP26. In closing, these milestones demonstrate the decisive leadership by Pacific governments, with support from CROP, the private sector, civil society organizations, and development partners. As we look towards COP26, the Pacific with the UK and the rest of the world need to ensure that global solidarity and commitment, crucial now more than ever for the sake of humanity, is manifested in the outcomes of COP26. COVID-19 is here today, but climate change impacts are being felt around the world and will continue unchecked and increase in intensity and frequency unless we take action now. Thank you, Facilitator.
Thank you so much, Mr. Taloiburi, the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat Team Leader on Climate Change and Resilience. Just before we joined our third member of the panel, just a reminder to the rest of us who are joining in on this first in the series of the Blue Pacific Talanoa, please just mute your microphone as we listen and enjoy the conversation that has begun. Just mute your microphone, please. It takes me a great pleasure to welcome from the Northern Pacific, Ms. Kathy Jetnil-Kijiner, who is the Climate Envoy for the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Now let's join Ms. Jetnil-Kijiner.
Thank you for having me today. So the RMI recognized early on the importance of setting the pace for climate ambitions. I think we in the Pacific are especially cognizant of the ways in which our region is vulnerable, and I think Dame Meg Taylor really covered that in her statement as well. For those of us living in atoll nations especially, we feel that vulnerability all the more acutely. We just don't have the luxury of time. So instead of waiting for the larger nations to set the pace, we instead are choosing to lead by example. This was the reasoning behind submission of our NDCs. And we're showing the world that even with limited capacity and resources, we're able to prioritize the well-being of the global community, not just ourselves, but also the rest of the world. The submissions of NDCs are critical. They serve as political statements that demonstrates the country's stance on climate change, but they also serve as investment plans for necessary projects that can contribute towards curbing our emissions or helping us to adapt. With this in mind, our country's focus for the past number of years was on mitigation. We're currently in the process of implementing the RMI electricity roadmap. Our NDCs and our roadmap are based on our national energy policy, which demonstrates the importance of integrating climate policies with existing sectoral policies and ensuring that there's a streamlined communication between departments and sectors so that it's not just coming from the top, but that there's actual integration throughout every level. Our country's, now that we're embarking on the National Adaptation Plan, so we've moved from mitigation to now include our focus on adaptation as well. As I mentioned earlier, atoll nations are really vulnerable in this way, and so that's why the National Adaptation Plan has become a focus for us. We're calling our National Adaptation Plan our survival plan because this is all about ensuring our survival. An important part of this plan incorporates a community consultation and also gender and human rights-based approach, prioritizing the needs and concerns of our people. So we're incorporating a bottom-up approach and making sure that our community is aware of what's happening up at the top as well. PIF must continue to stand strong in pushing for a green recovery under COVID-19. And I think that's become really clear, that's been very clear from the various statements that have been delivered already. The Kainaki Lua Declaration outlines the importance of international community meeting their financing commitments for climate. And so this pandemic affords us the opportunity to funnel more funding towards building back better by putting the majority of that funding into green initiatives like renewable energy, green jobs, attaching strings to bailouts, and phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and coal. Because our countries in this region are facing a triple threat of the COVID crisis, the economic impacts, and climate change. So as I said, as Exsley really put, very well earlier, the Pacific region is punching above our weight. We are contributing the least amount, and yet we're doing the most on climate ambitions. And so RMI's efforts to drive climate ambition, it's a service not only to our people, it's not just about saving ourselves, but it's about also ensuring that the rest of the world is taken care of too. If the Marshalls is safe, then so many other communities around the world will be safe as well. And so that's what's driving us forward ultimately. Good morning, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jetnil-Kijiner. Now for our fourth member of the panel, we'll be joined by Mr. Ernest Gibson, who's the Fiji's youth leader and member of the United Nations Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. Over to you, Ernest.
Everybody. In the Pacific, we're taught to recognize the value of narratives and stories from the day we're born. You need to know who you are. Your mother would tell you the story and the voyage of your people. Every lick of the ocean, every patch on your sail. Each person whose life gave way to yours. You have a feud with somebody in your village. Your grandfather will tell you the story of the way that your families are connected, how the bond that you share is one that transcends minor squabbles. He will tell you the story of how in our cultures, relationships are integral to our survival. The climate crisis is no different. It's a story, an ongoing story, but one that we have the unique opportunity of writing the final chapters of. But like any good story, from the bedtime story you read to your children to breathe calmness into their dreams, to the Bollywood drama filled with plot twists and turns and musical numbers, it's multifaceted and full of intrigue. We designed this ending. I'm cognizant that I only have a few minutes, so I will abide by the advice that my mother gave me. My mother, in all her wisdom, says, Ernest, say 3 things because after 3, nobody is listening. And she's absolutely right. I found that things generally tend to go better when I listen to her, so I shall take this advice. The first part of this story is kind of the scene-setting component of the story. We must acknowledge the context that we are in and the systems within which we are operating. And in taking a leaf out of George Monbiot's book, I think I would be doing youth and youth activists an utter disservice if I didn't begin by saying that the system, no matter how much you sugarcoat it, is fundamentally broken. And I'm sorry if I sound bleak and cynical, but until and unless we are in a position to actively change this system that prioritizes profit over people, that still vehemently supports the capitalist economy, and quite frankly, that only highlights indigenous and youth knowledge systems when it benefits. Unless we do away with this, no amount of declarations or campaigns or social media rallies will get us on the path that we need to be on. We need to move away from this idea that our influencing, that our advocacy, and that our policy processes can continue unchallenged. The problems we are facing are multifaceted and ever-growing. Consequently, our approaches must continue to change. The slowness with which diplomacy and negotiation takes place in its current form does not serve our people well enough. At the end of the day, the one thing that we are all called to do is serve each other. So we need system change. Building back better, as Kathy says, means building back different. The second part of this story is kind of the build-up part of the story. It's the action part in the film, if you want. This speaks clearly to how we must engage youth in these processes. Youth engagement must be circular, it must be continuous, and it must be deliberate. Don't engage youth because it's cool. Do it because it's necessary. If the only reason you're doing it is for the photo op, you're doing it for the wrong reason. You may as well not be doing it at all. By circular, I mean when you engage youth, do it in a way that highlights respect for our contributions. When you seek advice from us, when you take our information and our data, when you have a conversation with us, come back to us and demonstrate where that information that was sought has gone. If it's gone nowhere, that's also something to tell us. Ensure that this engagement happens continuously and at all levels. And the third part of this story is an element of storytelling that people often, any good story leaves people wondering. I wonder what's next. What will so-and-so do after this happened? That's our job. What will we do next? The Kainaki Lua Declaration is great, but remember, good is the enemy of better. It can and must be improved. We're in a pivotal and dangerous space right now. Dependent on our action now, we can either comfortably in a position that is good for now, or we can further the work of the people that have come before us. To conclude, my call to governments and leaders and elected officials is this. Listen like we have the financial buy-in of a Fortune 500. Be open to our suggestions and our insight in the same way that you're open to the checks labeled donor priorities. And be willing to take a chance on us the same way that you are willing to take a chance on trickle-down economics. My call to us is never give up. Never stop shouting. Never stop changing. Never stop believing that this story of hope and success will be the story that our children will tell their children with beaming pride. For Exhale.
Thank you very much, Ernest, for that inspirational opening statement on our first of a series of our Pacific Blue Talanoa. And of course, it's on the theme, the Kainaki Lua Declaration for Urgent Climate Change Action Now. And now we go into the second segment of our Talanoa, which is to have a general discussion. So if you have questions, do use the chat option on your screen to send us your questions, and we'll be able to put that through to our 4 members of the panel, and we can have some discussion on it. So maybe I can start off the discussion by posing a question to all 4 members of the panel, and any of you is welcome to tackle the question. And that is, I think, a very important matter that more or less all of you have raised in your opening statement, and which is this matter of the pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you know, and the declaration, the Kainaki Lua Declaration is also emphasized about the need for countries to submit their NDCs this year by 2020. In fact, one of the key priorities of the Kainaki Lua Declaration that the leaders of the Pacific Islands issued last year in Funafuti in Tuvalu at a meeting is that all parties to the Paris Agreement to meet or exceed their nationally determined contributions in 2020 to pursue global efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. My question is, why do you say to parties who may argue, yes, we agree, but we are so busy with attacking the pandemic right now, and we just don't have the time nor the resources to attend to our NDC right now? Any takers?
I'm happy to come in first if that's welcome. I think from the UK's COP26 presidency perspective, we would say we just don't have that luxury. Climate change isn't stopping just because of the pandemic, and so it's essential that we continue climate action today, tomorrow, and in the weeks to come. Obviously, we understand that the pandemic has had a devastating impact on populations worldwide, and governments are having to respond to that crisis. But in some ways, the pandemic has shown that when governments want to, they can do remarkable things. They can invest enormous sums of money in tackling an immediate challenge. And I think that in some ways gives me optimism that governments can mobilize against events and challenges which threaten the lives of their populations. And that definitely applies to climate change. So that's certainly one of the messages that we're pushing as COP26 presidency. I think the other aspect of the pandemic would be that governments worldwide are now developing economic stimulus packages to relaunch their economies. And this is a once in a generation opportunity, as others have been saying, to be investing in green technology and to be investing in renewable energy. It's been proven that investment in renewable energy provides dramatically more jobs than investment in fossil fuels. The green tech sectors are going to be the growth sectors of the future, so countries that invest in them will be positioning themselves higher up on the innovation chain for years to come. So it makes economic sense to be taking this opportunity to be pursuing climate action.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Any other member of the panels wants to add on to those?
Yeah, I'll add on. I think we saw from, I don't know about everyone in the Pacific, but I know that there was a lot of Marshallese that were living out in California and in the US. And I think we saw from the wildfires that, swept across the West Coast, how damaging that was. And so the communities there were dealing with climate impacts, because the wildfires were exacerbated by record high heats out in California. They're dealing with COVID already. And then on top of it was this horrific fire that swept across all of their communities and left a lot of people, homeless. And so all I'm trying to say is that if they don't incorporate climate into their COVID-19 recovery packages, then if they don't take that into consideration, then they're leaving their community members stranded themselves, by not prioritizing both, then they're dealing with two types of crises, and that's going to make it a lot harder for them. So if they're not prioritizing their own people, then yeah, that's gonna, that's ultimately they're going to lose out. So that's what I would say personally. That's especially learning from what's already existing and what's already happening.
Facilitator, if I can add to those two responses. I basically have two points to make. One is to re-emphasize the point that Ambassador Oflaheti has mentioned, that you can quarantine COVID-19, but you cannot quarantine climate change. And so that it itself demonstrates the need to respond to both crises at the same time. The other issue that I wanted to highlight is that at the moment, there have been numerous studies and analytical work that has been done globally, which clearly shows the core benefits of countries rising to both crises simultaneously. There is a recent report that was recently published by the Global Commission on Adaptation, which shows that adaptation investments deliver more jobs per dollar spent than traditional investments. And the benefit to cost ratios range from 2 to 1 to 10 to 1. And investing in adaptation now is less costly than waiting for the next crisis to hit. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. If you have any question to other members who've joined us for this webinar, you're most welcome to use your chat option on your screen, at the bottom of the screen, to send your question through. Just put in your name and which country you're joining us from. Okay, maybe I should pose the next question to Kathy, the Envoy for Climate at the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Interesting that Marshall Islands, as you've explained, ma'am, has been the first country to submit their NDCs. For the benefit of other Pacific Island countries, foreign member countries that are working to submit theirs, can you share some of the lessons learned that Marshall Islands had gone through in resubmitting their NDCs?
I think it's really important that all stakeholders are taken into consideration when they're developing their NDCs, and that it's not rushed. We obviously, I think that was one thing that we learned from our process, is that it was a bit rushed. We wanted to submit it first, and we wanted to submit it sooner, but that ended up leaving a few important stakeholders stranded. And so I would say that, making sure that it's a process that's as inclusive as possible of all agencies and departments is a difficult process. That's why we're trying to do things a little bit differently with the adaptation plan, and making sure that, there's cross-cutting conversations happening across every department. And so with the NDCs, I would, obviously we're getting to that deadline where people need to be submitting their NDCs. But I would also say not to sacrifice the process in trying to make sure that in trying to ensure that you meet that deadline. The NDCs do need to be prioritized, and so it does need to it needs effort from across the board. It can't just be your climate change or environment department. It needs to be prioritized by everyone. Health, education, and we're already seeing the ways in which the global pandemic is linked to climate change. And so, now we're seeing how much more important it is to incorporate the Ministry of Health into our climate change plans and policy development. So that's one thing that I would definitely recommend and keep in mind.
If I could come in maybe quickly as presidency, I think I totally support what Kathy has just said. And I think it's also important not to sacrifice ambition for speed. I think we are seeing this in some parts of the world, thankfully not in the Pacific, that some countries are so desperate to get their NDCs submitted that they're being perhaps rather cautious and saying, well, we're not sure we can deliver very high emissions cuts, so we'll lower the number a bit because we're sure that we're going to be able to achieve that. I think from our position as presidency, that's quite dangerous, because if everybody does that, then cumulatively we end up with much lower ambition worldwide. So I think our message would also be for the COP26 to be a success, NDCs must be ambitious, and if countries need to take a little bit more time to make sure they get it right, I think we would be very supportive of that.
Apologies for that, technicalities. Ernest, you'd like to make a comment as well?
Sure, yeah, I did want to comment on the first question that was asked, and I think it's very similar to the responses that were provided by the other panelists, but I think it's really important to recognize that when you're looking at two really large crises like the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis, you cannot look at them as two separate entities, because that's something that the development sector has failed at doing for years. Trying to silo issues without looking at the way in which they fit into one continuous system is a problem, because it means that we're always trying to put out fires in one particular area while everything else is running rampant. I know that's probably not the best analogy to use right now, but it's apt. And so I think in answer to what you tell people who suggest that we should try and focus on one and not the other is to say, well, actually, we have a system that has allowed us to be so vulnerable to something like COVID-19 that hasn't worked. And so in order to ensure that we have some actual substantive change that is transformative and ensures that we're not just protected today and tomorrow, but also going into the future as problems continue to grow and manifest in multifaceted ways, we need to actually change the system entirely. And changing the system entirely means ensuring that we're better prepared for environmental shocks, we're better prepared for health shocks, we're ensuring that our economies are people-centered and around a human development index and not around sort of what's going to make you the most money. So the answer is look at things from a systems approach, not through silos.
Okay, thanks, Ernest. Thank you for that. We can come back to you on some of the very key issues you've raised there. Let's go to our first question that we've got with us here. And the question is, and any member of the panels is welcome to take it up. Is there a weakness in the design of aid and loans from the richer countries to Pacific nations that causes challenges, obstacles to supporting a stronger reaction to climate by Pacific states? How could the financial support provide for better outcomes? Anyone wants to take that up? Exsley?
Thank you for the question from Jill. I will start off by saying that, as I mentioned in my statement today, that the delivery of aid should be complemented by strengthening national public financial management systems and institutional capacities. That is critical because of the fact that at the moment, it's difficult to track the effectiveness of the resources that are being accessed and whether they actually make a positive impact to the lives of the most vulnerable, our communities, our women, our youth, our children across the Pacific. And also because of the fact that the limited capacity we have in the Pacific in a lot of our government administrations make it very challenging for them to absorb those resources that are coming into our region. In terms of the funding that is allocated to adaptation, the Pacific's perspective is that adaptation financing should be purely grant-based and not to be delivered in other modalities and instruments such as concessional loans or loans and so forth. I think the other key point before I stop is that climate and disaster risk financing must include health pandemics such as COVID-19 going forward. And I must say that under the Green Climate Fund, for example, there is a specific investment area under health, which provides an opportunity for Pacific Island countries to be able to tap into that and help them as part of their response to the health infrastructures that we are facing at the moment, but at the same time also building the resilience of their health systems to the impacts of climate change and disasters in the future.
Thank you, Exsley. Mr. Flaherty, you want to add something into that as well?
Sure. I mean, I think Exsley's well. I mean, I think I would see three ways in which this could be improved, and I think the question from Noah Seru also touches on this as well in the chat. I think the first thing would be, as Exsley has pointed out, capacity within Pacific states to manage the funds, and we're very conscious that in many cases we're the governments in the Pacific need help in order to manage these processes. And so we as presidency have been discussing this with the various Pacific organizations and seeing whether there's ways in which the international community can provide greater support in that area. And certainly if panelists today have any particular ideas, I would be very happy to take them away and to continue the conversation after this event. I think the second aspect would be the actual rules themselves. And of course, there's very good reasons why there's strong rules around aid and loans and the criteria, but nonetheless, are they always necessarily well adapted to every single country, notably in the Pacific? I think we are politely asking that question of multilateral organizations and donors, and I think that's another area where we do need to continue to ask those questions and see if things can be simplified while maintaining, of course, security around the ways that these things are managed. And then the final question would be the nature of the finance itself. And we in the UK have been very clear that we think that finance should be pretty much balanced between mitigation, so action to drive down emissions, but also support for adaptation and resilience as well. And I think it's important that other donors follow the same approach, because we cannot just abandon states to be dealing with the consequences which they're facing today of climate change, as others have pointed out.
Thank you so much for that. And it seems that the questions are beginning to flow in. So we'll take a few. Thank you, Tony.
Sorry, can I speak a little bit on that as well?
Okay.
Sorry. I guess I just wanted to highlight that with our country in particular, we're also seeing the difficulties of accessing those funds, and just the timeline, it's too long for the funding to come through. And I think that's something that's really guided us in who we end up working with and how we, especially with the National Adaptation Plan, you know, we had options where we could receive funding, but that it would take a longer period for the implementation of the National Adaptation Plan. So we had to go with this other option that's sooner, because we just don't have the luxury of time. And so I think that that's kind of, it's a catch-22, I guess, in a sense, in the sense that we are doing all of the work and we are also on the front lines, but we can't access the funds to do the work that we need to do to save ourselves, in a sense. So that's actually something that I also wanted to highlight, just to add on to what Exsley and also Ambassador had already mentioned. Thank you.
I'm afraid you're on mute. Okay, Mr. Pareti.
Mr. Facilitator, you're on mute.
Apologies for that. The screen just went blank on mine. Let's take the first question from Tony Fala, joining us from Aotearoa, New Zealand. The question is, what are the ways panelists are inviting ordinary grassroots Pacific communities to drive climate mitigation or adaptation from the grassroots up? What are the ways panelists are inviting ordinary grassroots Pacific communities to drive climate mitigation or adaptation from the grassroots up? Who wants to tackle that question?
I can speak to that a little bit. I actually serve in two roles. I serve as climate envoy for the Marshall Islands government, but I'm also director of the nonprofit Jojigu. And so that's a youth environmental nonprofit that works with youth on climate change. So I actually, balance and see both kind of realms of that kind of work. There's the national level work, but then there's also the grassroots level work of coordinating with youth and making sure that they get the support and get access to programs that can incorporate them meaningfully into climate change work. It's specifically through small grants processes. We also have online here as one of the not panelists, but one of the participants in today's Zoom call, Laitia. Laitia is the director for the MICNOS, the Marshall Islands NGOs Council out here in the Marshall Islands. And they are the ones who are accessing grants also to look at energy efficiency, and they're actually implementing this project where they go around and support NGOs in ensuring that they lower their emissions and they lower their use of energy, and that they're more energy efficient in the work that they do. And they're also providing training as well. So so far it seems like it's mostly self-directed and is through smaller grants. However, I will also say that we have local NGOs that sit in our adaptation working group meetings, and that are a part of the National Adaptation Plan Committee. And the Adaptation Working Group Committee is actually a part of the National Adaptation Planning building. And so there's representatives who are representing those NGOs at the national level. And so that's how we're incorporating them, is they're actually a part of the strategy, also the development of the national.
Facilitator, if I can add on the regional opportunities that are available. Thank you, Tony, for your question. As you may be aware, the Pacific Resilience Partnership is in place, which promotes a multi-stakeholder approach and also welcomes the voice of grassroots people across the Pacific. And so if you want more information on that, we would be happy to provide to you and how you will be able to participate. At the international level, under the UNFCCC process, we have what they call the high-level action champions at the moment between the UK and Chile as the previous co-president. And so we are working with the UK's high-level action champion on a possible Pacific regional dialogue on resilience and adaptation over the next couple of weeks. And that is an opportunity to showcase success stories from our communities and grassroots across our region.
Maybe just to jump in really quickly and share a couple of things in answer to that question. There's one that's happening at a global level, which has been launched by the United Nations, which is the UN 75 campaign. And it's a campaign that I currently work on. But at the moment, we're working in 10 of the Pacific Island countries, specifically aimed at reaching out to the most vulnerable communities and designing what are the things that people would like to see change in terms of the way in which development work that comes through the UN happens in their communities. Looking specifically at what would they like to see more of, what kinds of things have not been working, and what are ways in which we could start implementing very specific changes now to ensure that the development sector going forward is a lot more responsive and effective to the current situation. And so if you need any further information on the UN 75 campaign, feel free to reach out to me directly or to a UN office based in your country. And then another one which I will plug here is done by 350. So 350 Pacific supports country nodes across the region. And in 350 Fiji, they've done a really specific focus around indigenous knowledge systems, looking at ways in which we can update our ways of agriculture. And then the most recent one was around how can we incorporate Solo-Solovaki, or this idea of community sharing, into our practices. And so again, they're all over social media, so feel free to reach out to them as well.
Thank you, Ernest. Okay, considering the time that we have left, maybe I should just pose 3 of the many questions that are pending. From Noseru here in Fiji, to all panelists. Thank you to the Pacific Islands Forum Secretary General and panelists for opening statements. Question: implementing national adaptation and mitigation priorities will be a challenge because of stressed national budgets because of the pandemic. So access to climate finance is essential for Pacific Island countries, which is a key challenge to implementation. What is a key issue Pacific Island countries face to access climate finances, and how can we as a region and as development partners support each other to facilitate access to climate finances? That's from Noah Seru. Tess Newton, Bulavinaka, Tess Newton Kane joining us from Brisbane. Question is, what significance can we place on the recent announcement from China of the intention to achieve net zero emissions by 2060? And thank you too to Samit Suleiman. The question from Samit is, are we doing enough, nationally, regionally, globally, enough to confront the human mobility challenges arising through climate change? If not, what ought to be done? Any of the three questions, any of you panelists want to take up? Thank you.
Is it okay for me to come in?
Flahati.
Thank you, thank you. I mean, first of all, just to pick up very briefly on the discussion we just had around youth, because I think for us, this is the top priority for the COP26 presidency. And we're clear that it is young people who will see the impact of climate change much more than people such as myself. And so it's very important that they are part of the solutions that we're identifying as well on climate change. Our partners, Italy, will be hosting a youth COP before the main COP next year. And in my own interactions, I'm very keen to be having meetings with young people and other groups. I would say, I would also note the importance of gender in our approach, inclusion overall, indigenous peoples as well. So there's a large number of different groups which we're very keen that their voices are heard so that the solutions we deliver are genuinely inclusive ones. Otherwise, if I may just quickly respond to the question on China, because I think it's a fascinating one. The announcement by China last week was undoubtedly momentous. We don't know exactly what it means because there's an awful lot of detail that will need to emerge on exactly how China will be reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2060. But there is no doubt that this is a major step forward. And if China is to meet that target, China will need to be moving much faster away from coal and much faster towards renewables. That will have benefits for the world, but not just in terms of carbon emissions, but because of sheer economics. If China is investing so much in renewable energy, the cost of renewable energy will come down due to economies of scale. And so those benefits will be felt worldwide as well. Likewise on zero emission vehicles and many other areas, if China is moving that fast, then that will have net knock-on effects on the rest of the world. Now, of course, as COP26 presidency, there's a very much more immediate consequence for us that we will be using this to encourage other countries to show similar, if not greater, ambition in the months ahead. And naturally, I've already been starting to do that in my own engagement in other countries worldwide. Thank you.
Facilitator, if I can, yes, if I can just quickly respond to those three questions. So the first one, I believe in the earlier responses and as part of the panelist statements, we've already identified some of the key challenges that our region is facing in regards to accessing climate finance. And one of the key issues we have in the Pacific is the fact that about 55 to 65% of all climate finance that comes to our region falls outside of the tracking mechanisms of national systems. So it's not tracked. So that is something that needs to be addressed. But I think it's important at this time for our members to also emphasize the importance of quality investments. So quality basically means it's not just about the quantity of the resources that they are accessing. It's about the quality outputs that would be achieved from the limited resources that they have at this time. In regards to the second question of China's recent announcement, in addition to what Ambassador has mentioned, I think it's assuring to hear China coming out with that announcement as the top emitting developing country, and so having that commitment from them is important. And so I think it also then provides momentum to others to be able to step up their actions on climate change. In regards to the question on human mobility, the PRP that I mentioned earlier does have a technical working group on human mobility being co-led by IOM and GIZ. There is some work being happening in the region on this particular issue. And so at the moment, that's currently work in progress, working with some of our atoll islands in the Pacific.
Thank you so much, Exsley. Kathy, did you want to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to add. Oh, sure. Yeah, I just wanted to add in terms of the youth movement and action that RMI has really been trying to make sure that youth are incorporated into a lot of our processes. We've had youth representatives with our delegation team at all the COPs since Paris. And we have some very vocal youth advocates, including Selena Lim, Carlin Jajak, amongst others, and Nenel Kaminaga. We're trying to work on developing a program that actually is going to provide training and support to our youth international advocacy, and getting them to understand a little bit more of the technical and also the kind of the COP and in international realms, that they're more suited to have a seat at the table. I think one of the things that always stands out to me is a statement from a young climate activist, Brianna Fruin, who once said she finally got a seat at the table, but then she realized she didn't know how to use the forks and the spoons. You know, just ensuring that, you know, we're bringing in youth mindfully and meaningfully, and that they have the tools to be able to engage in the conversations on a really, you know, meaningful level. And again, yes, definitely, I'm also part of 350 Pacific with Ernest, and they've done a lot of work in that realm too. Beyond that, we also our nonprofit does work on, just ran a climate change and arts camp, you know, teaching youth how to turn their fears on climate change and the anxieties that they're feeling right now into art, so that we're transforming them from passive victims into actual active creators. And so these are like a number of different initiatives that we're looking at here in the RMI on youth advocacy and youth empowerment. Besides this, I just wanted to add also that the momentum that Exley mentioned is really relevant, you know, to on China, on China's commitment. They've started something by committing to 2060, and so I think that that's positive. But we're being cautiously optimistic. We are definitely hoping to see we need to see the action. Basically, they need to put their actions where their commitments are. And then I think that's all that I wanted to add. Oh, also I did want to add that RMI was also in the international realm of youth. We had a program with the Kongesh Pledge, where we were hoping we began this pledge alongside Selena Lim, our youth advocate, where we got governments to pledge to incorporate youth in a meaningful platform through government representation and also policy level and decision making. And so the Kongesh Pledge was a pledge that we drove alongside Ireland. The Marshall Islands drove alongside Ireland at the last climate summit. And so we're trying to find ways to incorporate them into our processes as well in the Marshalls. So I think I covered most of it, but that's what I just wanted to add. Thank you.
Maybe just two really quick comments from me. Sorry, Samisoni, I know you want to jump in, but very quick ones. And the first one is linked very closely to what Exley was saying around the politics of the way in which aid comes in, specifically around climate financing. And we really need to look at the way in which aid enters different countries, because oftentimes a significant amount of that aid gets locked up in various other things that don't reach communities. Our aim needs to always be ensuring that we're making it down to communities. Otherwise, I mean, at the expense of, at the risk of sounding really rude, we're using it to pay salaries and not to ensure that we're driving the future that we want. And then the second thing is very closely linked to what Kathy was mentioning about ensuring how can we find ways to ensure that youth are being incorporated in the most meaningful ways. And the easiest way to do that is to ensure that they're included from the beginning. So when you're designing a project, bring youth along to ensure they understand how you write a project proposal, how you budget correctly for that proposal, how you create the work plan that ensures that you're working backwards to ensure you're attaining the results that you need. That's the kind of involvement that we need. We don't mean we just want to be invited to the fancy end event and then shake hands with the document that was created. Yeah, apologies. I'm not the most politically correct individual, but I hope you get my point.
That's why you were invited, Ernest. No need to apologize. Well, as time, the clock is telling us that we are supposed to be wrapping up, but thanks to the organizers, they've agreed that, as usual, when the Pacific people have their discussion, we tend to enjoy having a discussion. Sorry, Your Excellency Ofulhati, being late in London. We'll just continue for the next 10 minutes, and then we will certainly need to wrap up, because we have two other questions that we're going to conclude with. Firstly, Krishnil Narayan from Fiji, Bulavinaka Krishnil. The question is, what are two concrete and actionable things that younger members of the Pacific population can do to create transformative changes as suggested by the panelists between now and COP26 next year? What are the two concrete and actionable things that younger members of the Pacific population can do to create transformative changes between now and COP26 next year? And from Peter Natal, his question to all members of the panel is, there are specific areas in this crisis where the Pacific has shown outstanding leadership despite its small scale. The international shipping debate is one of these, where the Republic of Marshall Islands' role as the third largest shipping registry has led a unique Pacific High Ambition coalition to force this sector to pivot to decarbonization. Does the panel have a comment about how we can use such scenarios to magnify a Pacific voice and drive harder in this sector? So those two questions. Maybe the last one from Peter is for you, Kathy, but Chris Neil had also a very interesting question. Maybe Ernest, you want to tackle that one first?
Thanks. I was about to jump in on that one, but I will answer Krishnil's question with one answer, because I think it's actually a really big thing that needs to be done. And I think it maybe will be like one answer with probably several sub-activities that need to be taking place. But you're absolutely right, Krishnil, when you say that you need to be ensuring that when you use the COP process, you don't think of COP as the only thing. COP is but one single element of a much longer process. And so we need to ensure that the pre and post COP activities are all in place. The thing that Pacific youth need to do now is ensuring that we're communicating with each other and streamlining our efforts, our position, and our activities so that when we go to COP, we have a unified voice. The strength that the Pacific has when we operate in multilateral intergovernmental spaces is that we hold the collective voice of independent states. And this is the same way that we need to be behaving at the different levels. And so I think the simple answer, which is not really a simple task, is talking to each other, understanding what our positions are, and finding ways in which we can continue to add value. Remembering that this isn't a competition. Our survival is for us to ensure that we're working together and taking this forward as much as possible. So the answer, I think, is streamlining and communicating with each other to ensure that we aren't fighting each other for a space that is for all of us to share.
Thank you, Kathy. You want to have a say on the question from Peter?
I actually was thinking that Exsley might be better suited to answer, only because we, obviously this is one example of the ways in which the RMI has used our positioning and our platform on a very specific issue on shipping, right? And I think that that's we recognize that we have one of the highest numbers of shipping registry. Our shipping registry has the highest number of registries in the world, and so we recognize that, and so we decided to use it as a sort of platform to lower shipping emissions, rather than we basically took responsibility. And so I guess in a sense, what I think RMI has done really well, and I think the Pacific as a whole has done really well, that we can continue to capitalize on, is being that moral authority, being that moral voice, in these discussions. And ensuring that we're leading by example just as much as encouraging others to also make the changes that they see that they need. So I think I'm actually curious what if Exsley has, from PIFS side, some more to add to that. What are other ways at which sorry, I'm not trying to pass on the question, but I'm actually, genuinely curious what what his perspectives might be on the ways in which other Pacific countries as a whole can come together in, in that realm.
Thank you, Exsley.
Thank you to you, Kathy, for this opportunity to provide a comment in response to Peter's question. I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that the emissions from sea transport is quite high, and so it makes sense for countries not only in the Pacific but globally to consider extending their NDC targets to also include sea transportation. And so the government of RMI must be commended for leading on this work in the Pacific. And I note that other Pacific Island countries are also engaging closely with RMI in regards to understanding better this work that the RMI is doing. And also noting that a lot of our countries in the region are currently reviewing their NDC targets. And so there's clear opportunities where they could look at adding the shipping sector into their new revised NDC commitments. The second point I want to make is that there are clear financing opportunities that could be leveraged from this work in terms of the approach that is being undertaken within the blue carbon discussion. And so those are opportunities that our region would be able to unlock with RMI's leadership in this space.
Thank you, Exsley. If there's no other comments, maybe this is an opportune time to, is there another question coming through? Maybe we take this as our last question, last question from Christina Fidali. Apologies if I didn't pronounce that correctly. From Christina, I would be happy to hear about current efforts going into system thinking from regional, national, and communities, and what is the particular role of communities in this space. Would be happy to hear about current efforts going into the system thinking from regional and national communities, and what is the particular role of communities in this space. Any takers?
You go ahead, Kathy.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
No. I was just going to say, from a COP26 perspective, we think this is quite an important issue, and it's one which we've built in to the way that we're running our engagement worldwide. I'm lucky that in the Pacific, I think all countries in the region agree on the need to take rapid action on climate change. That's not necessarily the case worldwide. There are states which don't actually think that. And in those cases, we're not just giving up. We are engaging at state level and at county level and with business and with communities to make sure that there is pressure from within countries for action, even if the government of that particular country may not particularly want to go fast. Changing the subject entirely, I would note that there's been several decisions by US states in recent days, such as Michigan, declaring its ambition to be net zero by 2050, and many others. And so I think there's a lot of action that can be done at state level, at regional level, and at local level. Another example would be around coal, which is a big focus of my work in Asia. We're very clear that if Asia builds the number of coal plants it says it's going to build, we will not meet our Paris targets. So we are trying very hard to make sure those coal plants are not built. And in many cases, local populations do not support the building of coal plants, not just for climate change reasons, although also for climate change reasons, but notably for pollution, for health, for environmental impacts, and for economic impacts. So we're trying to work with communities in those particular countries to make sure that the opposition to coal is heard and that the alternatives, which are usually cheaper in renewables, are looked at instead.
Maybe it's the time before we will ask Secretary General Dame Taylor to make a concluding remarks. We just have time to go around to all members of the panel for your concluding remarks. And we will ask you if we can confine your concluding remarks to 1 minute each. So who's going to start off for us? Ernest, maybe your concluding remark for 1 minute.
Well, I'm not going to say anything different than I've shared already, but I think my concluding remark will need to be something around, we need to ensure that we're working to change the system that is fundamentally broken. And if the work that we're doing isn't aiming to do that, then it's perhaps not the thing that we should be doing. So always work towards system change, ensuring that we're working to benefit broadly communities. And do so in an inclusive manner. Thank you.
Thank you. Kathy, you'd like to have your final say? Thank you.
Yeah, I guess it's just really important to keep our ambitions up and to keep leading the charge for the Pacific. I think that there's a lot of technical work happening on the ground that's really very difficult and, you know, laborious, but it's worth it. You know, ultimately, this is a process that needs to be inclusive also. It needs to be inclusive across sectors, across islands, across communities, and I hope that the rest of the Pacific is also, you know, prioritizing that. But I also think, you know, at the end of the day, that the Pacific will needs to continue to come together and hold a really strong stance in our messaging and in our encouragement of the rest of the world to lower their emissions and also to submit their NDCs. The NDCs need to be prioritized. Thank you.
Excellency of Lahati.
I guess three things. Just first of all, thank you to the Pacific for leading the charge on pushing climate ambition worldwide. The second thing would be, please keep it up. Please continue to press the large emitters to drive down their emissions. Lead by example, as Kathy has said, in submitting ambitious NDCs. And the third point would be the UK wants to work with you. And we want to hear your ideas, hear your concerns, and to coordinate with you in the run-up between now and COP26. So I very much hope this is the first of many conversations with the Pacific Island Forum, and I look forward to further cooperation. Thank you.
And Exsley, you have the final say.
Thank you very much. I wanted to end with 3 points. One is the 10 calls underpinning the Kainaki Lua Declaration for Urgent Climate Change Action Now is still relevant as we prepare towards COP26. And so it may be an opportune moment for us to take a stock take of where we stand in regards to this commitment that has been made by our Pacific Island Forum leaders last year. And also the final point is that it is more than words on pages. Each of us that participated in this webinar today has a moral duty to translate the calls in the Kainaki Lua Declaration into our daily actions so that we are able to demonstrate to the global community that we are taking urgent action to addressing this climate change crisis that is facing our Blue Pacific.
And we are thankful to Dan McTaylor, Secretary General of Pacific Islands Forum, for being with us through our discussion this morning, and she will make her final remarks as well.
Well, thank you very much, Samisoni, for facilitating this, and I really appreciate you giving your time to come to do this with us. But let me say thank you to Ambassador O'Flaherty, thank you to Kathy, thank you to Ernest, and of course thank you to my colleague Exsley for this very rich conversation, which I have to say has given me much more to think about. But I just want to with the United Kingdom that we hope and trust that you will be a strong partner to the Pacific as we move towards COP26 and then post COP26. And I hope we can have a further discussion before we get to COP26 on these issues. I also want to emphasize that the Pacific has to stay together on this. If we fracture, then our efforts are going to be fractured, and we need to make sure that the collective is strong. I want to thank the leadership of the Republic of Marshall Islands. In the past, we've had the support of Ambassador Broom when I first came here to work at the forum. And I want to say thank you for the leadership now, in particular on the issues that you've been dealing with around the shipping issues, which is very important for many of us to learn from and try to get this into the NDCs of the other countries in the region. I want to thank Ernest for the enthusiasm and the desire to be involved for the youth, and just for us to make sure that we can try and facilitate a way for youth and civil society to be involved in the discussions and the preparations of the NDCs throughout the Pacific. Because I don't think we've done enough in that to make sure that all our countries submit. I want to thank you all in the region who have participated in this and sent in your questions. And I'm sure if you want to get more answers, you can send in questions and the panelists will respond. But thank you all very much, and we will continue these discussions over the next months.
Thank you, Secretary General Dame Meg Taylor. And that's it for our first in the series of our Blue Pacific Talanoa. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you particularly to the members of the panel, as well as our friends from around the region and beyond who were with us this morning.